Hello, everyone. Welcome to Buildings NY Unlock's first inaugural virtual education. My name is Chaya Mulberg. I'm the event director for Buildings NY, and I'm delighted to welcome you all today. A few housekeeping notes before I introduce our speaker. I would like you to know that this educational session is being recorded. You'll be able to reference it on demand through our website and through SiteCompli, and we'll give you more info on that. You are all muted, but you're welcome to ask any questions throughout the presentation, and we will get to them if we have some time at the end. You will see at the top right of your screen a speech button with a question mark in it. Simply click on that, and you'll be able to chat with us and write your questions in. So thank you again for participating in this educational seminar. I am very pleased to introduce Kristen Harrington. Kristen is the product marketing strategist for SiteCompli and is going to present today on mid-year NYC compliance issues. Thank you, Kristen, and welcome.
Thank you, Haya. Hello, everyone. It's so great to be here today. As Haya said, my name is Kristen Harrington. I'm a member of the team at SiteCompli, and if you've heard of us, thanks so much for joining us. We're so glad that you're here today. If you haven't heard of us before, SiteCompli is the leading provider of property operation solutions here in New York City. So we help teams manage everything from local law compliance, both changes and responses, to performing better on-site inspections, and everything from enforcing standard operating procedures and protocols across your portfolios. And because we work with over 1,000 property management organizations, many of them, again, here in New York City, we're very well versed in New York City local laws and how they impact owners and managers. So today, what we're going to specifically focus on are some of the most recent local law changes and adjustments, and especially that were made in the wake of COVID-19. So as the city begins to reopen and as things possibly change at a very rapid pace, some of which we'll point out in the next few slides, we wanted to bring you up to speed on the most important things that you need to know when it comes to New York City local laws. So with that, I actually want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer of sorts. It's very tied into what's going on now. Everything that we cover today is accurate as of our live session. I actually went on this morning. I checked every city agency site and every news source that I knew to make sure that things we were going to discuss today were still relevant, still in place, and still accurate. That said, it is very possible that things may change in the near future. In fact, when we gave a webinar update in March with a lot of the, just recently made COVID-19 changes, we actually had to make an adjustment in our presentation an hour before we went live, which is not a bad thing. It's good that, all of us in the industry are constantly checking and making sure that we're on top of these changes. But that's really what I wanted to inform you of, is anything can change at any time. Rule changes have been announced without much lead time at all. In fact, one of the examples we're going to talk about later, the due date was actually changed about a week before it was initially due, of sorts, and we'll go into that. But as you can see, things are happening, and they're happening at a very, very rapid pace, and that's especially dependent on external developments. So obviously, as we start to go through reopening phases, we're going to see a lot of things possibly reverse. We're going to see maybe some new regulations, but it's also possible that depending on what happens with COVID, we may see some changes as well. So it is very, very important to make sure that, that we can stay on top of this. Another thing I wanted to point out is, because there are so many things going on, because we're going to talk about a lot of different city agencies here today, I'm only going to really cover the big, basic, broad strokes headlines. Now, what that means is I'm going to talk about things like elevator inspections. We're going to talk about things like facade inspections and maybe changes to current regulations or modifications. I'm not necessarily going to cover the very basics of those regulations themselves. That said, if you do have a question, as Haya said, we love questions. Please ask your question. As we said in the chat format of GoToWebinar, and we'll see. We'll make sure either that we can address it at the end live, on the air, or if we can't, we'll get back to you individually in person, certainly within the next few days. So feel free to ask those questions, but we are going to be going over the very broad and very critical changes as opposed to getting in depth on how these things typically work. For any details, if you want to learn more, if you want to access things like forms, any documents that I reference, you can also visit our blog at sitecompli.com/blog, B-L-O-G. Oh, there we go. It's got everything that I'm going to discuss here in today's webinar in much more detail, in addition to key links to city documents, city references, things like that. So that way you can easily go ahead and look into some of these things immediately after our webinar. That said, our team is also going to be working on a follow-up email to all of you. So many of the things that we touched on here today, we're going to send you those resources directly. So if you'd like to look at them immediately, feel free to head on over to the blog. If you'd rather wait for our follow-up email, we're going to get that out over the next few days, but do know that we want to be in touch with some key resources that'll help you continue this compliance education going forward. So with all of that said, before we get started, I want to do another break of sorts. I want to ask you a question. I'm really interested in learning what you're most concerned about, especially when it comes to local law changes. So if I could ask Tommy, who's from Reed Expo working with Buildings New York, to go ahead and trigger our poll. I'm going to go ahead and throw up this poll and see what local law changes that y'all are most concerned about. All right, there we go. I'm going to give you a few seconds, maybe 20 to 30 seconds to answer this poll. I'm going to have some water while we wait. Yes, in case you're curious, this is a Rugrats cup. I am a child of the 90s. Very awkward waiting for the poll answers to come in, but all right, how are we doing, Tommy? I think maybe I'll give it a countdown. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Tommy, can we go ahead and release the results? Oh, all right. This is super interesting. Okay, so it looks like 37% of attendees are most interested in required filings. That's things like elevators, facades. We are definitely going to talk about those today. And also new violations issued during this time, 32%. So not a huge difference there. We're going to talk about some of those as well, some of those in regards to construction, which doesn't seem like as much of a concern as others, but we are going to touch on that because there are a lot of changes there. And we're going to talk about general COVID specific rules as well. In fact, that's what we're going to start off with. So if we can go ahead and take that poll away, I'm going to go into the next slide. And we're going to kick it off with some regulations that are specifically tied to mitigating the risk of COVID-19. So back in March, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene released cleaning and disinfection guidelines for buildings. They actually released lots of sets of guidelines, but specifically one set for non-healthcare related buildings, so many office and residential spaces, that closely followed the recommendations of the CDC's own guidelines. And what these guidelines do is they basically address which cleaning solutions are appropriate, what types of PPE your staff should wear when they're, cleaning and disinfecting the space, and kind of how you go about that cleaning and disinfection process, what areas you should focus on. And mostly, in general, again, this is a pretty lengthy document. It's a couple of pages or so I'm not going into a lot of the details. But for example, you definitely want to focus on things like high trafficked areas. So any common spaces, entryways, things like elevators, things that are used frequently, as well as high touch areas in specific locations. So doorknobs, bathrooms, anything that has surfaces that are frequently touched. So those are things that are listed specifically in the DOHMH guidelines that you can definitely reference. But what I do want to say, and we actually got this question before the webinar, so I want to address this explicitly. The Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, or any other New York City agency that we are aware of as of now, they're not inspecting buildings for proper cleaning and disinfection. I want to be really clear with that statement. They're not going into yet residential spaces or office buildings in issuing health related violations for failure to properly disinfect or failure to properly clean. There's been no regulations of that sort just yet. There's no explicit kind of enforcement program or task force there. So I want to be really clear with that. I think what's really important to address, though, is that, following the guidelines issued by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene is really critical, and not in a, well, if we don't file them, we'll get a violation sort of way, but certainly in a making sure that we are, as much as possible, minimizing the risk of transmission of COVID-19 in our buildings. Because as you know, there is a complaint line. Complaints can be filed for violations of social distancing with the state, and the city can enforce those complaints with fines of anywhere from $500 to $1,000. And that's just now. Again, that may change. But also, as we know, there are robust contract tracing teams being developed. And so if anything is traced back to your properties, that's certainly something that we want to avoid, especially when we're trying to, make sure that we can keep building residents, building occupants as healthy and as safe as possible. So the guidelines are very much just that. There is no enforcement in terms of, regular kind of inspections or violations yet. Is that something that would happen in the near future? I'm not sure, and I honestly wouldn't want to speculate. But as of right now, there's kind of no, set in stone enforcement manners there. Of course, as things change, as things evolve, that may change and evolve as well. But there was a question that we received, and so I wanted to be, very, very clear about that. And again, it sort of tends to the whole, anything can change at any time. But we want to be explicit in that the Department of Health has not announced anything of this nature, and neither has, the Department of Buildings or any other associated agency so far. Of course, agencies like HPD are still issuing violations for specific things that are in the housing code very specifically, but as of yet, there's nothing that has been added there that is specifically tied to COVID from an enforcement perspective. That said, I also wanted to note that when we're talking about, COVID regulations and phases, phase 2, which potentially may happen very soon in New York City, will allow office buildings to reopen. And again, there are a lot of guidelines here. As I said, possibly could happen as early as Monday. So something to certainly tune in for. That's something we've seen on the news back and forth lately in terms of New York City being ready for phase 2 or not, but it looks like the data is trending in that direction, which is great. That said, if you manage office buildings, for your own office buildings where you work, I would be aware that the guidelines that are issued from the state, from New York State, are mandatory. And that's interesting too, right? The words guidelines and mandatories in themselves seem kind of at odds. But we actually, up at the SiteCompli blog, have the document from the state link that is specifically tied to the reopening of office buildings. And it's several pages, and the way it works is it kind of breaks things down into different categories. And on one side, it says mandatory requirements. So, for example, things like masks, providing masks to your workers, things like ensuring that, people aren't sharing desks. Those are listed in the mandatory column, whereas things that are in the best practice column are things like putting up signage, taping out circles on the floor, ensuring that people, are aware of those kind of social distancing guidelines. So you can see and read the difference between yourselves. And again, understand that not just for the space that your team works in and you operate out of, but also for any office buildings that you may manage, because I think this part is really critical. You're going to want to ensure that everyone from your tenants, any companies that are in your buildings, to, of course, your staff that works at those buildings, are aware of those state guidelines, and they're aware of any changes made to those guidelines as soon as possible, and that they're able to put those things in place to minimize risk and keep occupants safe. I think that's really important. So again, those guidelines are posted up at the SiteCompli blog. We have a whole phase 2 outlet there, and that is something that we will send as a follow-up. So those are kind of the COVID specific regulations and guidelines that I wanted to address right off the bat. Moving on from there, I wanted to talk about construction a little bit, just because, this is something that might impact you in the near future, depending on, what your plans are at your portfolio. And it's been a little complicated as of late with all the changes, right? So Phase one actually began on June 8th, which allowed construction sites to reopen. So before that, it was just essential construction. The state was saying that only certain types of construction sites could continue work. But now, as of June 8th, as of last week, the weeks are going by so quickly, the state is now saying that all construction sites can resume work. One thing that you have to keep in mind, though, actually there are a few. One of the first things you have to keep in mind, though, is before reopening the site, you do need to submit a site-specific safety plan to New York State, not to the Department of Buildings, not to New York City, but to New York State. And in addition to that, you also need to acknowledge, they have a PDF, which you sort of virtually sign and acknowledge, that lists all the new safety requirements for construction sites. And those requirements includes things, again, like proper signage. They have examples of some of the signage that you can print out and post up at sites in the proper spots. Face coverings. Folks are required to wear face coverings. There is some detail on there specifically, regarding what jobs they're working, and kind of it goes into, again, a greater level of specificity, but in general, face coverings are required. You're also required to have hand washing and sanitizing stations. So that's another thing that you're going to want to be aware of on your site. And of course, proper social distancing must be enforced. Now, unlike guidelines for office buildings and residential buildings, the Department of Buildings, so the state issued these guidelines, but the city, the Department of Buildings, is actually going to be enforcing these guidelines. They're going to be conducting inspections of all construction sites. That's all of them, all construction sites in the city. And they're actually also going to be conducting sweeps, which means after they've done initial site inspections, depending on the amount of inspectors they have on the ground, depending on their ability to do this, they're actually going to revisit sites. And it's possible it could be at random, or it could be, informed revisits, but they are intent on doing sweeps there as well. And something you should know is after a 30-day period of leniency, so we're in that period right now, 30 days from June 8th, essentially, violations will be issued without financial penalty to sites for failure to have the proper signage, enforce social distancing, not have the right hand washing or sanitizing stations, or not follow any of the other laid out requirements from New York State. So you have 30 days essentially to kind of ensure that your site is complying with every single guideline from New York State for construction. After that 30-day period, violations with fines will be issued. And it's possible that after repeated non-compliance, failure to not comply can result in penalties, the DOB has said, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 per violation. So it's really, really critical that if you are doing construction, if you're planning on starting construction, that you're aware of these things, that you're aware of all the state guidelines that you have to follow, that you can ensure that your team is doing everything possible to stay safe, to follow those guidelines, and again, prevent this escalation. And on that point, I also think it's really critical to ensure that you're speaking with all the right people on your construction site, and for a number of reasons, for enforcement, and also because a lot of things have changed. So for example, there have been several recent updates to DOB Now Build. That, of course, is their online filing system. Many applications, PW1s, 2s, 3s, many other types of applications that used to be filed in person or through a separate system must now be submitted online. So they are no longer accepting a number of construction-related filings in person. That, of course, was a result of COVID. That could be something that extends long into the future, but it's really important that if you're working with code consultants, expediters, contractors, that you're having these conversations, that you understand not only what's going on at your site and ensure that your site is as safe as possible, but also that you understand, what things are being filing where, what you're specifically responsible for, so you can understand, what's going on and how changes impact the work that's going on at your property. So just wanted to very quickly drop that. And also quickly reference, if you're at a residential building and you're undergoing construction and some units are still occupied during that construction, you're probably familiar with something called the Tenant Protection Plan, or the TPP. There have been some recent changes and updates to the Tenant Protection Plan. So starting Monday, June 22nd, both the applicant, whoever is filing, and the property owner, I should say the job applicant and the property owner will be required to sign the new TPP1 form. That form is actually available now. You can take a look at it. Again, we've got it posted at the SiteCompli blog. We'll send it as a follow-up, but you can see what the changes are. Starting Monday, they will no longer accept the old form. You have to submit the new form. And in addition to the signing requirement, you also have some changes on there. So there are some changes about explicitly listing which units will still be occupied, and also explicitly listing means and methods for reducing noise per the noise code as part of your tenant protection plan. So those are some things you'll have to be aware of. In addition to that, if you have a tenant protection plan, you must also distribute to all of those tenants and post the related notice to occupants, which informs tenants of the construction, informs them of the existence of this tenant protection plan. There's a new version of that as well. Again, it's at the SiteCompli blog, but make sure if you have to submit a TPP that you're aware of this change as well. And one final thing I'll say with this, again, if you're doing residential construction, you're probably familiar with this requirement, but if you have to submit a TPP, you also have to notify the Department of Buildings 72 hours in advance before construction starts. So that's a requirement that hasn't changed. Just be aware of that before you go ahead with any construction to buildings that still have those occupied units or apartments. All right, with that said, we're going to move on from construction and go into required filings and other regulations. I'm going to start, keep going with the DOB. I actually want to start with Local Law 87, which relates specifically to energy efficiency reports and retrofitting. So due to COVID, you can actually request an extension this year to file your Local Law 87 energy efficiency report if it's due this year. Of course, this year, I'll take a step back. Generally, energy efficiency reports are filed once every 10 years for buildings that require them. As a reminder, the requirement is still most buildings 50,000 square feet and up. That is different than Local Law 84 benchmarking. Local Law 84 benchmarking changed a little while ago. So in the last year or the year before, and that requirement was reduced to 25,000 square feet. So if you perform Local Law 84 benchmarking for your buildings, if you submit that data to the city, if you're required to do that, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're required to submit a Local Law 87 energy efficiency report. There are separate covered buildings lists for each. And of course, if you're a SiteCompli client, you can go ahead into your account and confirm what you're required to do for each building. If you're not, you can reach out to us too. We're happy to help walk you through that process. But I just wanted to point out the difference there, that Local Law 87 is very much, as of now, still 50,000 square foot and up. Of course, again, anything can change over the next few years. Also wanted to remind you that this year's due date, the 2020 due date of December 31st, is for buildings with a last digit of 0 as your tax block number. So if you don't have to file this year, then you don't have to worry about this extension process. But if you do have to submit your EER this year, and for reasons related to COVID, if you're unable to, or you believe you'll be unable to, if you can explain that via the guidelines set forth by the Department of Buildings, you may be able to get an extension. And if you are able to get an extension, it basically pushes your due date back from December 31st of this year to June 30th of 2021. So make sure that if your buildings are required to submit energy efficiency reports, and this is something that you think may be difficult for your team, take a look at this extension, file it sooner rather than later so you have more time. And of course, so if for whatever reason it's not accepted by the DOB, you can make sure that you still get this energy efficiency report in by the end of the year. Again, if it's due this year, the last digit of the tax block number always matches the last digit of the year. So next year it's going to be 1, then 2, then 3, and so on and so forth. And one of the most important reasons why I bring up the Local Law 87 EER is because fines for this are very steep. In fact, if you fail to submit it, for the full kind of 10 years until your next round is due, you can see fines higher than $40,000 in total for this one report. So if you have any questions, definitely reach out to our team. We're happy to, again, walk you through this process, but do be aware that for reports due this year, there is a available extension for you. You should definitely take advantage of it if that's something that would help your team. But let's move on to the more widely applicable Local Law 84 benchmarking. Again, this is regular energy data submission annually for the previous year. So it's typically due on May 1st. And this is what I was talking about way back at the beginning of our webinar when I said, things change as much as 1 week before an initial due date, right? So benchmarking annually is due on May 1st of each year. So this year, May 1st, the 2019 data was due to the Department of Buildings. But about a week before that May 1st due date, the Department of Buildings came out and said, because of COVID, we are actually going to take away penalties. We're going to delay penalties, I'll be more specific, for 2019 submissions. And what that means specifically is if you haven't submitted your 2019 data, if you miss that May 1st due date, you can still avoid fines by submitting before August 1st. August 1st is that kind of next due date, the next quarterly submission deadline. So they have said that if you missed May 1st, if you still didn't fulfill this requirement, as long as you submit before August 1st, you can still avoid penalties this year. Penalties are typically $500 per non-compliant quarter. So if you submit by August 1st, you would be, skipping that penalty. This applies to all buildings on the covered buildings list. So again, that's generally 25,000 square feet and up. There are some exceptions and tweaks there, but again, we're happy to walk you through that. If you haven't submitted it, any owners who didn't will receive what they're calling a notice of non-submission. It's not necessarily a violation, but it's kind of a warning. It's saying, hey, we noticed this wasn't submitted by the due date, which is May 1st. It needs to be submitted by August 1st. If a fully compliant report is not submitted by August 1st, owners will be subject to violations for each quarter. So that's possibly up to $1,000. That's how the service notice was explicitly stated. So again, that's $500 for May 1st, $500 for August 1st. So if you want to avoid that $1,000 penalty, and again, possibly doubling it as we go on into November 1st and February 1st of next year, make sure that you are able to submit your annual benchmarking data specifically for the 2019 year before August 1st of this year. Again, if you have any questions, happy to walk you through that. But that is the case as of now. Whether or not penalties will still be delayed or extended has yet to be seen. It's quite possible that it may happen as we get up to August 1st and, there's not a lot of submissions, and so the DOB would want to extend that. But as of right now, that is the DOB stance on benchmarking. Moving on to other requirements, let's talk a little bit about facades. So the Department of Buildings, when they first put out all of their COVID-related regulations, they said that facade inspection safety program inspections, so your 5-year facade inspections, are considered essential. And also any repairs that you're doing, the unsafe facades, are also considered essential. And they explicitly said that there's no COVID restrictions on these. So any restrictions on, the number of people working or performing those inspections, because they're so critical to life safety, there haven't been any adjustments there. So I just want to make that clear. So if you are, gearing up for cycle 9, because technically we are in cycle 9 now, and you want to perform your cycle 9 inspection, you're part of that sub-cycle A, which goes within the first 2 years of the cycle, you can go ahead and do that. Also, if you're doing unsafe work, if you're doing any work on unsafe facades, which is required, then you can continue to do that as well. Of course, stay in communication with the folks that are doing those repairs, the people that are doing those inspections, the qualified exterior wall inspector. They'll be on top of any new guidelines and recommendations from the state. So make sure that you're having regular conversations, you're staying informed on the work that's going on at your buildings. I also want to say, now that we're in cycle 9, I wanted to address anyone that potentially didn't submit a cycle 8 facade inspection report. The DOB has done this in the past. In fact, I think they did this at the last cycle when we were transitioning from 7 to 8, and they've done it again. They're actually instituting what they call an amnesty program, this time for cycle 8. And that program actually begins July 1st for 3 months. That's actually an update from when they last announced the program. So they released another service notice saying that these dates had shifted. It's starting July 1st. And for the next 3 months after that, and again, subject to change, as everything is. If you did not submit a cycle 8 facade inspection, and you were required to, if you missed that requirement, you can administratively close that requirement by submitting your cycle 9 report early. So it follows amnesty programs of the past. It ensures that you are taking care of the requirement, and you're kind of filling out your future requirements as well. So even if your cycle 9 report for your building isn't due until subcycle B or subcycle C, all the way at the end of this 5-cycle period, you can take care of it early. Within these next couple of months, you can administratively close cycle 8 by filing your cycle 9 report early. And that's huge. I will say, you will still have to pay civil penalties for failure to submit cycle 8. So filing your cycle 9 early doesn't get rid of any, penalties for failing to file it on time. But it's really critical that if you take advantage of this program, you basically will be covered for both cycle 8 and cycle 9, and you won't have to worry essentially until a few years from now when we go into the next cycle. So I would definitely recommend taking advantage of this program. Again, discuss it with your qualified exterior wall inspector, with your team that works on facades, something that you'll definitely want to look into, and take advantage of it if you can. Of course, this is only open to non-compliant cycle 8 owners. So if you did submit a cycle 8 report, you cannot submit it early as part of the cycle 9 process. You'll still have to wait for your sub-cycle, which again is kind of on an overlapping 2-year program. Right now we're in sub-cycle A. Next year, you'll be able to start submitting reports for subcycle B. And then the year after that, you'll be able to start submitting reports for subcycle C until the end of the full 5-year period when the books close on cycle 9 in total. So I know facades can be a little complicated sometimes. If you have any questions, again, reach out to our team. We're happy to help. But those are the changes that were recently updated when it comes to facade filings. Next up, I want to talk about elevators. And I want to make something really, really clear because, again, anything is subject to change. It's kind of a broken record at this point. But as of today, no changes to end of year deadlines for inspections have been released. So your annual Cat 1 inspections, that is still very much December 31st. Also, the DOB has made it clear that they believe regular inspections are essential. So any elevator inspections that you're performing, those annual inspections or Cat 5 inspections, those can continue. They did not have to be halted because of COVID. So make sure that you're still getting those done, because as of right now, the deadline is still December 31st for those inspections for this year. Again, that could change. It's possible that it will, depending on other things that come into play throughout the rest of the year. But as of right now, the DOB has not made any updates there. One thing that they have changed, though, is any payments for open failure to file. So those are EV Cat 1s, EV Cat 5s, or failure to have affirmations of failure to submit affirmations of correction must now be made in DOB Now Safety. So they're no longer accepting those in person, offline. Any payments to correct EV Cat 1s, 5s, and ACC 1s, those failure to file affirmations of correction, must be made in DOB Now Safety. And that is very recent. That's actually as of yesterday was when that change was first put into play. And in addition, any request to waive civil penalties for these violations must be made in DOB Now Safety as well. So if you're going through that process, know that it has changed, that is now online in DOB Now Safety, and the service notice, which again we have in SiteCompli, actually goes through step by step and walks you through how to make those payments. One thing I will say is any violations, any EV Cat 1s and 5s from 2017 and later, actually require a current Category 1 inspection or Category 5 inspection, depending on the violation, on file in DOB Now Safety in order for the violation to be fully dismissed. So again, making payment is only part of the corrections process. You're going to want to make sure that your inspections are up to date, that you have a current Cat 1 if it's an EV Cat 1, or a current Cat 5 if it is a Category 5 inspection on file in DOB Now Safety for the entire violation to be closed and set aside. So that's really important. But again, happy to answer any questions you have about that process. Finally, when it comes to DOB regular inspections and filings, I want to talk a little bit about a new requirement, about something that is due to happen for the first time this year, and that's DOB gas piping. That's Local Law 152 specifically. And again, as of today, as of this morning, although things very well may have changed in the last 36 minutes since we've been on this webinar, but as of our last check with the city, the due date for new gas piping inspections has not been extended. The first round of these required inspections is still due at the end of this year at December 31st for eligible buildings. And those eligible buildings are properties in community districts 1, 3, and 10 in all boroughs. So it goes by your community districts. When they first released this rule, they had said, we're going to go borough by borough. And then they said, you know what? Let's do community district by community district. So now if you're in District 1, whether you're in the Bronx or Manhattan or Staten Island, it is due at the end of this year. And in fact, I want to reiterate, this is a really critical component to Local Law 152. Even if you don't have a gas piping system, they still want you to submit a certification, basically submit paperwork saying, yes, we certify that we do not have a gas piping system. They want to know either that you had your system inspected or you don't have one on site at all. And so that's basically the crux of Local Law 152, and that's what's going to have to continue, you know, every 5 years essentially. But as of right now, the due date has not been changed. Of course, we'll let you know if and when that does change. But right now, if you're in community districts 1, 3, and 10, you know, certainly link up with your inspectors, with your trusted providers for doing these inspections and for making those certifications again if you don't have a gas piping system, because you either have to submit one or the other, the inspection or the certification. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about cooling towers and water systems. And speaking of water, I'm going to go ahead and take another drink because I'm talking a lot. All right. So the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene posted new guidance for reopening different water systems in buildings. Water systems are things like drinking fountains, ice machines. Those are just two examples out of, you know, a whole group of different types of water facilities in buildings. But definitely talk with your engineering team, your operations team, to kind of go over what's required for your different water systems and make sure that these guidelines are being followed. And specifically, these are for buildings that have been vacant or have had low occupancy during this time. So if you're building, you know, if potentially you're an office building, that's also lower occupancy, and you want to make sure your water systems are up and running and functioning in a healthy way while folks are starting to come back to the office, definitely review these guidelines and ensure that you're kind of following these procedures to make sure that you're going by city's best practices. They've also released cooling tower guidelines and modifications. So if you have a cooling tower, you know that there are so many different requirements. There are requirements that have to happen every day, every 3 days, every week, every 90 days. You know, the list seemingly goes on and on and on. But the city has released some permissible modifications during this period, depending on whether or not your on-site building staff was impacted by COVID. So, for example, if the building has staffing shortages, DOHMH during this time is allowing you to follow an interim water quality monitoring schedule as opposed to, say, the regular schedule. But again, this is something that you should discuss with your water treatment professional, with your qualified people that are performing these procedures and inspections to your cooling tower, and of course with your on-site staff, to make sure everybody's on the same page. We have the updated guidelines over on the SiteCompli blog, so you can check those out, but we will send them to you directly as well. Now, if your cooling tower is off for the season, if you fully and completely shut it down and now you want to, resume things as people are starting to come back to different buildings and facilities, the Department of Health is saying that you can delay startup until you have the appropriate staff to complete the startup procedures. And they're also saying if you cannot delay startup, you can refer to the startup procedures for cooling towers in spring 2020. That's a recent update. That's on the blog as well, but they're very detailed in what you're required to do to sort of reopen the tower system and ensure that things are functioning properly, and of course that the risk of Legionella bacteria is minimized, which is very, very important, especially considering that's something that impacts respiratory systems, which we certainly want to prevent during this time period. So that's what the updates are for cooling towers and different building water systems. Let's jump now to a different agency entirely. Let's talk a little bit about OATH and the ECB. And I want to be really clear because, we get a lot of questions about the ECB, the Environmental Control Board, and lately I've been referring to it as OATH, the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. And that's because this city has actually, I believe, last year or potentially even earlier than that, they went ahead and readjusted their systems again and kind of rebranded any of the agencies that had hearings under ECB under the broader and larger OATH umbrella. So that's really important. So in the future, if you're looking for ECB information, you may see it under OATH, and that's because, again, the city is recognizing it as OATH. They have kind of reorganized the way that they refer to hearings, and so we want to make sure that we're using those same terms as well. So just something to watch out for. But as of today, again, as of this morning, all OATH offices are still closed. So in-person hearings are not being held, and they will not be conducted until the stay-at-home order is lifted. And so, that's interesting too, because it's quite possible that it may take them a few days to kind of, after the stay-at-home order is lifted, to go ahead and reconfigure their processes, ensure that they're able to have, a limited amount of in-person hearings, or again, reconfigure the way they have hearings to make sure that folks are safe when they visit any in-person offices. But as of right now, they're not having any hearings in person. You can schedule remote hearings by phone, and you can actually do that pretty easily. They have different email addresses that go to each borough office, and you can write to that address. You can request a hearing by phone. You just have to provide them with some very specific information, just 4 easy pieces of information. And once you do, they can go ahead and schedule that hearing for you. You do have to request a hearing by phone if you want one before the hearing date. So it's not something that you can do day of, potentially, at least, according to their guidelines, and it's not something that you can do after the fact. What they are doing, if a hearing is missed during this period at all, so from mid to late March through now, this policy is still in effect, is they're automatically rescheduling missed hearings. So we know typically if there's an OATH hearing and it goes missed, usually it goes into default. So default summary judgment, meaning, there is a fine that is issued based on the default level, and kind of the defendant is automatically sent into a sort of guilty stage. But now they are not making any default decisions. They are staying default decisions and penalties, again, for now, and they're temporarily rescheduling, temporarily suspending their rescheduling rule as well. So any request to reschedule hearings will be granted. That's very different from their usual policy of you have to be within a certain date period. So they have changed a lot of their procedures in terms of missed hearings. And of course, again, since they're not having in-person hearings, they've given some more options as well. So you do have some options when it comes to OATH. You do have some flexibility, but again, as of right now, as when I last checked 45 minutes ago, they are staying those default decisions, and they will automatically reschedule any of those hearings that are missed. So keep an eye out for those rescheduled dates. Again, ensure that you're prepared because the offices could open up at any time, and you may want to have those hearings in person. But also, if you're ready to have a hearing, you can ask for one and make that request to have it on the phone as well. So those are your options when it comes to OATH and any hearings that you may be dealing with right now. I also want to really quickly address a change that I saw via HPD Residential. This was actually posted on the 16th, so that would be Tuesday. So a very, very recent change. previously, HPD was limiting inspections to what they called dire conditions, right? We were in heat season, so any heat-related complaints, any hot water-related complaints, anything else that they considered to be dire. Now, that language has actually changed. HPD has said that they are making inspections in response to complaints. That's different from saying that, they're not inspecting except for dire conditions. They're just prioritizing certain things. The things that they're prioritizing are lack of hot water, because right now we're out of heat season, but hot water is a year-round requirement, lack of essential services, mold, lead-based paint, window guards, and any re-inspections in response to property owner requests. So if you requested a re-inspection, if you did a violation dismissal request potentially, that is something that they may be prioritizing during this period. It seems that they, as an agency, have moved up to the next stage, and instead of saying we're only inspecting specific things, they've now broadened that scope. So because of that, and because this is also very, very recent, there may be more inspections. There will be more inspections from HPD, certainly over the next coming weeks and months, but that may also result in a larger number of violations. So we've seen, on the data side, that HPD violations were still being issued for, again, very specific things, sometimes still in the bulk that they were issued in the past, but right now, again, this change may result in more violations. So it's still critical that in addition to your building being, clean and disinfected and safe, that you're also staying on top of any regulations that could, result in a violation, because those inspections are going to start to pick back up, at least according to HPD's new language. So again, we'll let you know when there's a change here, but this was a very, very recent change that is a departure from their language they've been using over the past few months. So wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And the last agency that I want to address is the FDNY. And I think it's interesting because we've gotten a lot of questions about the FDNY, about how they're handling, permit renewals, about how they're handling, specific types of violations. There are so many things, obviously, that we all know that the FDNY and their administrative side manages and keeps track of and, deals with. But with all that said, they haven't specifically announced any policy changes. So unlike some of the other agencies, they haven't gone ahead and made, explicit changes in their documented and, publicly available information to say that, we're changing how we operate and here's how. They've done some soft changes, and I'll discuss them here, but I want to be really clear. So when it comes to the FDNY, we think it's for the best that you not only, consult with your team, you consult with your FDNY and safety consultants, but you also contact them directly so they can help you work through any specific questions you may have regarding a specific permit, a specific certificate of fitness, anything that needs to be removed, or of course a certain or specific violation. We think that's really important because they're really going to be the only ones that can give you a lot of detail on any process changes going forward for that specific instance. That's not to say that they may not make announcements for changes in the future. That's very possible. But they, for the most part, one of the great things they've done is, in addition to kind of implementing screening processes at MetroTech, so if you need to visit MetroTech, you can, although they are limiting parts of the service there, so be aware of that. They've also opened up 2 specific emails. So for violations, because they're not processing certificates of correction in person, or at least not until further notice, they now have a new email. It is curedesk, CUREDESK, at fdny.nyc.gov. This email address has been very responsive when we reached out to them about specific violations or any questions that we've had. So you can definitely submit your certificates of correction there. And they've also been able to work through any issues about email attachments or things that you might need help with when it comes to actually submitting that certification. So I would certainly reach out to them if you have any questions about a specific violation, or of course, if you want to continue to submit certificates of correction for any open FDNY summonses, notices of violation that you might have. Another email which we found to be very, very helpful and again, really responsive is the FDNY business support line. And that's fdny.businesssupport@fdny.nyc.gov. And this email is for more general business questions. And in fact, if they don't have the specific answers, what they've been able to do is put us in touch with specific people at the FDNY who can help answer those questions. So again, if it's about permits, if it's about inspections, certificates of fitness, if you have questions about FDNY requirements that are related to your business, to your building, you can contact this email address and they'll be able to help you out, or at least point you in the right direction. So the FDNY has opened these two great resources, both of which you can reach out to. Again, both of which we found to be responsive during this time. But of course, if you need help or direction, just let us know as well. But I would certainly, save these emails, make sure you have them handy, because I think they'll be great resources in the weeks and months to come for sure. Now, with all of that said, we've given a lot of updates for a really long time. What does the future look like? And the answer is, it is still up in the air. I've mentioned a lot of times that things can change. Again, it's very possible that things may change as early as this afternoon, or possibly even while we were speaking here together today. So one of the most important things is to stay updated, to make sure that not only are you keeping in constant communication with your team, with your advisors, but that you're staying on top of these local law changes, because they are changing at a rapid clip. And again, if anything changes in the direction of COVID data, it's possible that some things will revert, or different regulations will be announced. So it is more important now than ever to make sure that you are getting regular updates. With that said, I know that our team is actually going to be back here with Buildings New York again, presenting another webinar next month, the keys to better, faster on-site inspections and routines. And while we won't be diving into specific local law regulations, we are going to be talking a lot about some of the ways that New York City owners and managers are employing best practices to make sure that when they have people on site, they're able to do work more efficiently in a safer, better, and more direct way. So information is shared with all parties, and you're able to still get the things you want to do done in a fast, efficient manner. So we're going to be talking about that. But again, I think it's another example of making sure everyone on your team is in constant communication, because things are changing now more than ever. I'll also give another plug for the SiteCompli blog. Again, that is sitecompli.com/blog. You can visit there at any time. We have articles on all of these featuring different city documents, links, highlights, everything. And of course, if for whatever reason the question you need answers for are not there, hopefully we can get to some now. I know we have a few minutes, so we are going to try to answer some questions. But you can also reach out to us at support@sitecompli.com, and our team is always happy to answer any questions you may have there. So with that said, hi, there's some questions that we want to go ahead and take a look at.
Yes, thank you very much, Kristen. I wish we were in a session we could all say thank you. It was amazing, a lot of information, clearly laid out and easy to follow. I believe we'll be sharing the deck with everyone. We do have some questions, and I think the maybe best thing to do is take them in the order of which they were given. I would like everybody to know that we will be able to follow up. Kristen will actually be able to follow up directly with you if you've asked a question and we don't have time to get to it today. So I think, and I thought, well, I would tell you the ones that popped up a lot, but there wasn't anything that popped up. People's questions, there seemed to be a lot around who's responsible for doing some of these things, but really kind of just going in order. Marco wanted to know if there's any news on when HPD dismissals will start again.
Yeah, that's a great question, Marco. Thanks for asking it. So according to HPD's most recent language, they have said that owner instigated inspections basically will be part of this kind of newer wave of HPD inspections that will be happening, this broader opening of HPD inspections. So it's very possible that since dismissals are initiated by submitting forms by managers and owners, that it will be part of that process. So I assume that potentially, if you have any open items, you can contact HPD to see if and when they'll be coming. Otherwise, they may be contacting you, informing you of that as well. Or, they may also just start inspecting buildings and kind of go from there. So I know that's, not a very specific answer, but I do want to say that HPD, as of the past few days, has broadened the number of inspections that they're doing, the type of inspections that we're doing. And so I think dismissals, if they're not part of that, will be very, very soon. So I would, kind of ensure that buildings are prepared for that things are corrected. So if and when they do arrive, you're able to have a successful inspection. That's a great question. And I also, oh, sorry, I'm looking at some of these. Lots of really great questions.
Yeah. For example, will the Department of Buildings fines for construction, will those be issued to the contractor or to the building owner or both?
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, I can say anecdotally, I've seen that violations have been issued to the contractor a number of times. I've also seen DOB construction related violations issued to the owner. The one thing I want to say about that kind of relationship, and an interesting turn we've seen over the past few years with, name respondent specifically for DOB related violations, is even if a violation is issued to a contractor, it's issued at the owner's building, right? And so what the DOB has done is in the past few years, they've instituted a number of enforcement programs and a number of regulations, anything from, they've even explicitly stated that if violations go uncorrected, at specific sites, permits may not be issued for that site or possibly for that owner. They've said things, obviously, some of you may be familiar with the AEU has one. That's when there's a class 1 DOB violation that's issued at a property. It might be potentially to another name respondent, could be for a tenant, could be for, again, a contractor, anyone that's at the building. But because it was issued at the building, if it's not corrected immediately, and we found immediately means anywhere basically between, about around 60 to 90 days, that the owner themselves may see additional penalties of $1,000. So regardless of who the name respondent is, whether it's the contractor or the owner, and again, we've seen both, there are general penalties for kind of not responding to violations. If it's a specific type of violation, usually DOB because it's safety related, and if it's issued at a specific building. So I think that that's really important, and that's generally a good watch out too, is anyone that you have on site, if they garner a violation, especially if it's from the Department of Buildings or the FDNY, it's something that you're going to want to keep track of, because if it's not addressed quickly, or if it's not addressed correctly, that may have a harmful impact on your site or your building in the future. So just something that you want to be aware of. Again, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule there. We've seen both. It's possible that we may get clarification on that going forward, but I think that's a really, really great question. I'm just gonna see if there's one or a few.
Okay, while you look, I would just like to thank everyone for their participation. Remind you that you'll be getting another email from RX Digital after this, probably tomorrow, where you'll be able to provide some feedback. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Be sure to let us know of any other topics or speakers you'd like to hear on these virtual sessions. And again, we thank Kristen very much, and we'll keep going through these questions until our time runs out. And don't forget to come back next month to hear her speak again. And in between that, next week on June 25th, we have a virtual education sessions on the new realities of managing rent-regulated apartments through Post Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, HSTPA. So we hope to see you for that. Did you find one that speaks to you, or shall I keep going?
I did. I found two questions
Please.
actually. I think hopefully I have time to answer both of them. But also we want to thank, Haya and her wonderful team at Buildings New York for having us here, for hosting us as part of this webinar series. We're excited to see you again in a month. But until then, if you have any specific questions, support@sitecompli.com. Don't hesitate to reach out. I will also be addressing these questions that we received today that I haven't answered live over the next few days. So once we, make sure we have everybody's email addresses and get that all lined up, I'll be reaching out to you directly and giving you some more information, hopefully. I do want to answer two specific ones though. I did get a question that says, how do we know if we're required to file Cycle 8 or Cycle 9 facade inspections? So if you have a building that is 7 stories and up, they're required to submit regular facade inspections, part of the facade inspection safety program. So it's likely that, if you've been doing this for a while, you're familiar with the process and familiar with kind of the cycles. But if you're not familiar with the cycles, then you should know that anyone that was required to submit for Cycle 8 will also be required to submit for Cycle 9. So it's generally kind of one of those all or nothing positions. Again, the only exception is that if you missed your Cycle 8 filing, the DOB is allowing you to essentially file it late, still pay a penalty, but then that filing will cover your cycle 9. So it will kind of like cover both of them. That's typically what happens with amnesty programs. But again, 7 stories and up. If you have any questions, if you use SiteCompli, we actually have it tracked in your account as to whether or not you've had past filings and the status of any current filings. But if you do have any questions, support at SiteCompli.com. We're happy to answer any questions about your specific building. One other thing that I want to address: does the new TPP1 need to be submitted if we already submitted the old TPP, or is the old TPP still effective? So based on the service notice, I believe this is essentially, it shouldn't have to be kind of a go back. If your construction is ongoing, if it has been ongoing, you should be able to, you still have that TPP1 in place, so that still kind of holds sway. But for any construction that basically needs to submit a TPP1 as part of their new application, as part of their new process, then they'll have to use the new form. Otherwise, anything that's still existing should still be effective. One thing I do want to say, though, that isn't really clear, and so actually I would like to get some clarity from the DOB and HPD on this, is we know that you have to notify the DOB if you're starting construction 72 hours before you're starting construction, at least in those buildings that require TPP1. I'm not sure if that applies to this COVID restart. If I'm being extra careful, I always assume an error of kind of, an over judgment of saying like, yes, I would want to notify the DOB that we are resuming construction on this site that has, tenants and occupants still in it. But, they haven't made any like COVID specific clarity or languages, given that now as of June 8th, you can essentially like restart the construction that you may have already had ongoing. So I want to point that out. I haven't seen any clarifications there, but that's something that we can always look into, and hopefully we'll get more information on, if there's a general broader request for clarity. Well, I'm already 2 minutes over.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are out of time. We have taped this. It's a lot of information, and it's so topical and relevant for what's happening right now in our world with COVID, with buildings coming on and different phases happening. We thank you so much, Kristen and SiteCompli, and everyone who's participated. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you at our next session.
So good seeing you virtually.
Thank you. Bye.